Good evening. My name is Toby Tichton-Back, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Resource Center in Buffalo. It's August 7th, 1989. We are at Channel 4, and our guest this evening is Sidney Cole, who has a very interesting story about being a prisoner of war and a liberator. Sidney, will you tell us your story?
Well, first of all, the only reason I'm here, and when you called me, I wouldn't have come normally, but when you mentioned would go in the archives of the Holocaust, then that just changed my mind completely. Now, this is something that I put in the back of my mind many, many years ago. I didn't want to think about it too much, and it came out just by speaking to you when it was 4 or 5 weeks ago,
yes,
whatever it was. But that's the only reason I'm doing this, because of the Holocaust. And if one person in the entire world gets anything out of this interview, I'll be happy about it. Just one. I want people to remember what really happened back in the old Nazi days.
So now, tell us your story.
All right, I'm going to tell you a real fast story.
Don't tell us fast.
Well, whatever it may be. But in 1940, I enlisted, registered for the draft. I immediately was put in a 1A class. I knew eventually, with war in the upcoming, that I would be drafted. I did not want to be a foot soldier. I wanted to be a pilot. And I just made up my mind to do that. And I tried and tried to get into service and couldn't get anywhere. I finally made connections in New York City. I went there, took a physical examination, passed it. Then we had to take a mental exam. And after many weeks, we went to the University of Syracuse, and there were people from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York State, and I know possibly 80, 100 youngsters took the examination. Nobody could pass it. It was something that was beyond reasoning at that particular time.
No one passed it.
Nobody passed it. And incidentally, with the physical, there were very few people passed it also. Out of the 80 or 90 that we took, possibly 12 or 15 passed it.
So you were an excellent
I was in that group, right. Of course, I was a lot younger then, too. But anyhow, I still didn't give up my quest because I knew eventually I'd be drafted. So I finally decided to go to Canada. And I finally went to Toronto, took a physical and a mental the same day, and they told me to wait a telegram. They'd let me know the outcome. I got a telegram to report for duty that I had passed both the physical and the mental qualifications to enlist in their Royal Canadian Air Force. I went up there and we checked into Manning Field, which is the exhibition grounds of the Canadian National Exhibition. And after many inductions and shots and programs and so forth, I didn't see an aircraft or anything for 3 or 4 months. It was all groundwork. And then we started our training. And I completed my training at the end of 1945. Or no, I'm sorry, 1940, 41. December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor happened, I decided I wanted to come back to the United States. Being a volunteer with a USA patch on my shoulder and the enlistment papers that I had signed when I entered the Canadian service, I could ask for a discharge at my will. Well, anyhow, I put in for a request to be discharged from the service, and it finally came through after a few months. I reported to the United States, went to the draft board, and waited there because they didn't know what to do with me at that particular time with the qualifications I had just coming out of service. And they weren't set up yet for any type of enlistment or so forth and so on. Then they called me in and asked me if I would be interested in taking glider pilot training. Now, in order to be qualified to do that, you had to have power ship training, which I just completed in Canada. So I agreed to it.
And you were an officer in
I graduated as a flight officer. So I agreed to it. I went into service here as an enlisted man. They sent me to Miami Beach to round up the 30 that was going to be the first class of glider pilot training in the United States. Well, from there, we went to Santa Fe, New Mexico. We went to Janesville, Wisconsin, and we took our glider, and then we were flying power ships right along, and then we were checked out by some of the Air Force pilots that came from West Point, and they were a very, very small organization at that time. And the complete 30 that took the first glider pilot training course did pass. There wasn't one failure. Then we went to 29 Palms, California for our first glimpse of gliders. And from the moment I got into a glider, I knew I didn't like it.
Why not?
I didn't like it because of it was so quiet that the noise was deafening. I can't describe it, because I was always reaching for a throttle that it didn't have. And I just knew that they wanted to use gliders in combat, and it would never work. I just knew it couldn't. Well, anyhow, I showed you, we graduated in 1942.
I think we have pictures of
Yes.
you in your
Yes.
uniform. Do you want to tell us about this picture on the screen here?
Well, that is when I was in the service in the Royal Canadian Air Force. That's when I first
And
entered.
that's 1940.
That's in 1940.
1940.
Yes.
Now we have another picture of you.
Okay. That picture there is when I graduated. Now we're getting ahead of the story, but I graduated OCS at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, as a field artillery officer. And
All right, so we'll come back to
We'll
this.
come back to that picture.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we finished with our glider pilot training, and one night I was OD, which is Officer of the Day, and at midnight a telex came through. They were looking for liaison pilot instructors. Now, liaison pilot people are ones that spot field artillery shells for field artillery battalions. And it's done, they have forward observers that are on the ground, and they have them in the air. And I felt that's what I would want to do, because it's flying and not glidering. And I went to my commanding officer the next morning after reading this telex, and he refused to release me. I went over his head and finally made connections and went down to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is one of the largest field artillery training camps in the United States.
You were really gutsy, weren't you?
Made through. And they said, fine, your qualifications are fine, but you have to be a field artillery officer. I was in the Air Force. I had nothing to do with a gun. I never took a basic training where I had to march and go through all the other equipment that a normal soldier does. Well, anyhow, I said I would. So they discharged me from the service for a C of G discharge, which is convenience of the government. And they sent me to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is a field artillery training camp. And that's OCS. And it's a 90-day course. Everything is double time. And I was in that group. I was, I believe, 26 years old at that particular time. And I was in with a group of VMI students that were 21, 22, fresh out of school, and had to keep up.
So you were
with
the
them.
old man.
I was the old man at 26.
So the picture is of your graduation from Officers Candidate School.
Officers Candidate School, field artillery training.
So we'll go back to the picture, and
Okay.
if there's anything in the
If
picture.
you go back to the picture, you will see that there are no medals, no anything. It's a field artillery insignia on my collar. Okay?
And what's
then
your rank here?
Second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant. When after a leave at home, when I graduated OCS, they went back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I was an instructor in liaison pilot training. After 3 or 4 months of that, I tired of it, asked for overseas duty, which they gladly recommended and okayed. And I was assigned to a separate field artillery battalion, not with a large group or anything. We were by ourselves. We were sent where we were needed. We were like a SWAT team with a police department. Wherever there was a problem, our battalion went.
This is 1944?
No, this is
43.
I graduated OCS in 1943, September of 43. November of 43, I was back in Fort Sill. I instructed for about 4 months, and that took us to 1944. Asked for overseas duty, immediately assigned to this battalion, went overseas, and then we got into combat in the middle of 44. And then I got to Paris right after the Russians, or the Germans rather, vacated Paris, and we were waiting for aircraft, and they finally came into Orly Field in Paris, and then we went over, and then we were sent on separate missions, wherever they needed us. And that's when I started my combat flying
So tell us
in
about that.
middle 44. Then we were assigned to the Battle of the Bulge. And we had been around Bastogne in early December. And the push started December 16th. And everything was a mess there. The United States Air Force, the English, the Italians, the Russians were coming in, and the Germans had concentrated everything they could, all their power. They brought in tanks from the Panzer Division.
From Africa.
From Africa. They brought in every available aircraft, every bomber, every foot soldier, every artillery piece they could use, and this was going to be the final push. They were going to take over Bastogne. And
where were you? You were in Belgium?
Bastogne is in Belgium.
Belgium.
Yes. And it was called the Battle of the Bulge. And the weather was horrendous. It was midwinter. I'll never forget, I was sent out on a mission Christmas Eve, and I came back and they had turkey at that particular time. When I came back, my dinner was gone. They had used everything up. There were very little food left outside of sea rations and canned food. Well, anyhow, I missed Christmas dinner. I missed New Year's Eve dinner. I was out on a mission at that particular time.
How many missions had you flown?
I had flown 126 missions.
Got a mission.
The last mission was 126th, and that happened January 2nd, 1945. And I had 125 missions with no parachute.
No parachute?
No parachute at all.
Why did you not have
We didn't have them available at that particular time.
They were not
just not
giving them to you?
No, no, the shipments never arrived from the States. We were very short of materials at that particular time. And
just you or, your whole...
The whole group. The whole
Rather
group.
dangerous going out without parachutes.
Well, you see, we weren't fighter pilots or bomber pilots. We could take off and land and be back in 6 or 8 minutes, and that's considered a mission. And that's why we acquired so many. That's how we could do it. But this particular mission, now January 2nd of 1945, I was ordered into the air at 3 o'clock in the morning. The temperature was hovering right around 4 or 5 degrees. The snow was 8, 10, 12, 20 feet high in drifts. The runways were completely blocked. We need runways to get off. We need a lot of room because of the ice and everything else. And we didn't have concrete. You didn't have any kind of that time. It was all mud and field, just open field. And it was just done by the engineers in a rush.
Was your equipment frozen?
Everything was frozen. We just couldn't start the aircraft. And we had to drain the oil out of the aircraft, heat it with blowtorches, pour it back in, and finally took off. Now, with this type of aircraft, the only heat in the aircraft is a manifold heater. And that shows very little heat. And you can't wear boots because the rudders and everything are small, and you have to operate with just your feet, and you have to wear very normal shoes. Luckily that day I put on a bomber jacket, which was warm.
Normally you would not have, is that
No, you would wear just flight clothes, which is a thin nylon jacket and suit. And I was ordered into the air. I had been up around 2.5 hours. My fuel was getting low. We couldn't spot too many of the field artillery shells because of the snow-covered ground. And we finally called for smoke bombs. And when a shell hits the ground with a smoke bomb, it sends up a column of smoke. Then you can zero in and observe what you're doing and zero in and be able to get aircraft and field artillery shells where you want to put them. And
did you see a lot of enemy at that point?
At that point, there was so much confusion. Our own planes were strafing everybody. They were just letting bullets fly from wherever they could, anywhere they thought the enemy might be. It was even on our side of the battle line. And it was just a state of confusion. The Germans were confused, our forces were confused, but everything was going. You just couldn't believe what was happening there. It was just a complete state of confusion. And my field artillery officer directing the ground fire would not let us come down. And when I told him our fuel was getting low, he said, go within 6 minutes and try to get back. And of course, we need a lot more time. And all of a sudden, our aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. We are sitting tandem in the aircraft. with a very small door, and the particular chutes we were wearing that particular day were seat packs. Now, there are two types of parachutes. One is a backpack that puts you forward in the aircraft where you can't control the aircraft too sensibly. The seat pack raises you up where your head is hitting the canopy.
Silly.
But we had them on, and when the aircraft was hit and I lost control, I put it in a glide position.
Oh, you were used to being a glide.
Well, the engine was shot out, so I had no power, but I had put it in. Now, in our training, when we were taking glider pilot training, our instructor would take us up 5 or 10, 8,000 feet, reach over, he was in the back, shut the ignition off, and you'd have to land in a circle. That was part of the training to be a glider pilot. Well, anyhow, it came in very, very good stead with me. And now, just to get back to the story, I ordered my observer out.
Out of the plane?
Out of the plane, because we were both going to jump. We couldn't stay in the plane, it was disabled.
So he had to go first?
So he went first because he was behind me. We opened the door, which is a very narrow door, and he got tangled up in his headsets and all these radio wires, and he was leaning out. He couldn't budge at all. I took my foot and shoved him out. I saw his parachute open. By the 3 or 4 minutes that happened between the time he got out and by the time I bailed out, he landed on the American side. I landed on the enemy side.
Just the difference of those minutes?
Just minutes, because we were right sort of in the center. And I was wounded, and I saw them shooting at me coming down in the air parachute, and I could see the holes popping up in the parachute. Now, evidently, I was hit in my arm and I was hit in the leg. Now, I don't know if I was hit when the aircraft was disabled or when they were shooting at me when I was coming down in the parachute. And I didn't feel it. When the aircraft was hit, I had a funny smell in the aircraft. And I can't describe it what it was, but it was not normal in that aircraft. And after I bailed out and saw these bullet holes, you know, you can guide yourself coming down with the shroud cords. And anyhow, I got away and landed at the edge of a forest. Completely wounded and
you were bleeding.
Bleeding profusely. And I grabbed the parachute, wrapped it around me, then I lost consciousness. And I woke up intermittently back and forth. And I think the second time that I woke up, I remembered my dog tags. I knew I was in German territory. I knew that the Germans were starting to retreat. And I took my dog tags and just flung them as far as I possibly could.
And you had enough strength for that. That's
well,
amazing.
You know, you get energy that you can't believe. And the dog tags, the reason, it had an H on them for Hebrew, and I knew I was in German territory, and to avoid any other massacre, whatever you want to call it, could happen to me, that's why I did it.
Was that instruction that was given to you?
No instruction whatsoever. And
your
again,
own common sense?
The instruction they had in parachute training was 2 hours. And part of the 2 hours instruction in parachutes, they showed me how they fold a parachute and how to pull the cord.
Oh.
Period. That was my instruction. And I laid at that. Now, I passed out in and out perhaps 36, 48, 72 hours.
You
I have
don't
no
know.
way of knowing. No way of knowing. And I don't think it was more than 48 hours because the Germans were retreating. And there was a tank that passed by me, manned by German officers that were retreating. They were running for their lives. They spotted me, stopped, didn't take me into the tank at all, but threw me on top of the tank.
Ooh.
Just threw me on, without the parachute, anything. Just physically grabbed me and threw me on.
And you were still bleeding?
I was, well,
It must have stopped.
It had stopped because the blood had crusted over. It scabbed over. And I was taken back to some small town or village. Where, when, how, hard to remember. And they turned me over to the Hitler Youth. Kids. They were in full uniform with the Nazi thing across their chest, with the brown pants, with the brown shirts, with everything. They were just like you see in the movies, just like you see anywhere where they show up these horror pictures. And these were anywhere from 12 to 19, 20 years of age. and they started interrogating me. And when I didn't answer properly, and they could speak very little English, some of them could, but not enough to convey anything that I would understand. So every time I didn't give them a right answer, I would get it. And then they never would hit me in the face. It was always in the body, in the groin, in the shin, on the shins, and so forth.
But they couldn't understand what information you could possibly give anyway.
They were just so incensed by being a Nazi. They were born and raised in that era. Their families, their fathers, their mothers, their
They were
whatever.
just hating
They were just hated them, and Americans, especially when they had a pilot, because we bombed their cities, we ruined their beautiful Berlin, all the buildings were shut down, all their culture, and they just had a hatred for pilots like you couldn't believe. Well, anyhow, when they got through with me, they threw me down in a cellar, locked the door. Now the cellar in these German villages, no windows, and you could just see the stone, the way these little houses were built. And it was extremely damp in there, and there was a mound of old rotten potatoes down there.
So you hadn't eaten for days and days?
Probably 3 or 4 or 5 days. And they just threw me in there. Then the next morning, for some reason, I was put on a truck, not a other vehicle, thrown in the back and taken to a Red Cross tent where they were treating German soldiers.
Do you know where you were?
No, have no idea. No idea. Somewhere in Germany. And this German doctor was just treating the Germans first. And then when he got to me, which I was, of course, the last one he ever looked at, there were paper bandages. He did wrap my arm, he wrapped my leg, and gave me a tetanus shot. Now, why or how he did it, I don't know. But actually, it helped. And then from there, I was sent to some other place where they tried to interrogate me. I couldn't answer. I was put on a train and taken somewhere else, and they tagged me severely wounded. And of course, on the train, there was some bowl of soup. There was some food.
You were taken care of by German soldiers?
All by German. Everything was German. And on this particular train, there was a English doctor that was captured long time ago. I think it was 1939. He was a major, a medical man. And he had very little equipment. He had rusty tweezers. He had a little black bag with nothing in it, paper bandages, perhaps some mercurochrome. There was nothing. They might have had some sulfa powder. I don't know what they had. But anyhow, he was picking this shrapnel out of my leg. He couldn't do anything with my arm because the fragments were too small and they were embedded too deep. And he couldn't open up the scar on a train, a moving train. And there were other prisoners on the train.
Were you in tremendous pain?
Well, there was no such thing those days as pain pills or anything to alleviate it. It was just the way you were. The way you were, that's the way it happened. And that's the way you stayed. And then I went from camp to camp to camp. And everywhere I went, I remember laying somewhere for a day or two in a large room with a wooden floor and perhaps 100 prisoners, just laying on the floor, awaiting orders, awaiting to be shipped out. And finally, I got to a stalag, which was a prisoner of war camp. And the stalag was ironically 4F.
4F, that's something you would remember.
In the meantime, they had wired a dog tag on me, a German dog tag, when I got to that camp on my bad leg.
They wired it on?
Wired on, tight.
It's amazing you didn't get a tremendous
gangrene or infection or so forth. But I think the tetanus shot overcame a lot of...
We have a tape of your stalag dog tag. Can we see it? Oh, can you... It has your numbers on it.
It has the numbers that was assigned to me as a prisoner of war. Now somewhere, if the records are still available in Germany, it would show Stalag 4F, a date I was brought there, my name and number. Now, where or when, I don't know.
Would you tell us about life in a stalag?
Okay, now, when we got to the stalag, there was a captain who was the senior ranking officer and 3 other officers, myself and 2 other officers. And of course, the first thing we did is have a meeting of the officers and to see how we were going to handle ourselves and our escape routes, what would happen if we're ever liberated, what would happen if we ever overcame the German guards, and we were split up into different battalions. And I was charged of Battalion 3, and there were possibly 80 prisoners under my command.
All American?
Mixed. There was English, there was Italian, American, and so forth. And we were the only ranking officers there. The rest were enlisted men. Now, incidentally, before I go into this thing here, anybody that was Jewish was called and taken out in a work party in this particular Stalag 4F, and I never saw them come back.
Oh, you never saw them come back?
Never saw them come back. Rosenberg, Finkelstein, Kohn, whatever it may be, 4, 5, 6 at a time, were taken out. They were assigned a work party, never saw them come back. Whether they were killed, whether they were transferred to another Stalag, I don't know. I presume they were dead. They were executed.
And nobody ever knew you were Jewish?
No. When I threw my dog tags away, when I was interrogated, and they started registering my name, I told them that I was Protestant. And
did they ask you anything about liturgy?
They didn't bring up religion whatsoever. Beyond that point, what is your religion? What's your age, your name, your rank, your serial number? Where were you born? What outfit were you with? How many airplanes and aircraft do they have? How many tanks? How many field artillery battalions? How many infantrymen? All those questions, which I did not answer, except the pertinent questions to my own personal use.
Did any one of your fellow prisoners know you were Jewish?
No. I didn't go around saying I'm a Jew.
No, you kept that
no, I kept that
discreet.
As discreet as could be. And then I was in that camp possibly 2.5, 3 months.
What was the treatment like?
The treatment was horrible. There was no water, there was no hot water, there was no food, there was no medication, there was no showers, there was an outside pump with well water that rank, filthy, rotten, rusty, smelly water. There were no shaving equipment. The meal was 1 in the morning, 1 at night, and both meals were alike. It was a potato soup with grass in it. It was anything they could make to try to make it a little thick. Now, I have a very interesting thing to tell you. They once issued us bread, and one of the German guards and I tried to converse, and we sort of got a little bit friendly. And he brought me a loaf of bread. Now, this loaf of bread was baked in 1939. It was in a wooden box, completely sealed. It was a replica of a little coffin, and it was made out of wood. It was like balsam wood. It was very light, and you could just go like this with your hand and fingers and penetrate, rip it open, and there was a fresh loaf of bread.
In other words, it kept it for
4 or 5
years?
Yes. Now, they had produced thousands and thousands, maybe millions of loaves of bread.
In Germany?
In
it was
Germany.
Made in Germany
Yes.
that way. That is interesting.
They had prepared. Yes. And this was it was a little like this, just like a regular loaf of bread, and it was in a little box that represented, it was just amazing how they had prepared all this, scheming ahead for food and so forth.
Did you have to work in this town?
No. Now, there were work parties. There were ditch digging, there was cleanup and everything. But with my rank, and I was a second lieutenant, no, I was never assigned a work detail.
And did the Red Cross ever come through?
Okay, toward the end, maybe in the second month, there was a Swiss Red Cross representative came through, and he did give us some. The Germans. My mother did get an MIA telegram.
Oh.
She has it. My mother passed away, but my sister still has it to this day. And the food was just horrible. Everybody lost weight, but particularly myself. I went down to 95 pounds.
From what?
From 145.
In 2 or 3 months?
In 5 months.
In 5
really,
months.
Really.
Oh, January until...
Yeah, January until then.
Okay.
Because up until then, until I got to the Stalag, I had never really eaten a full meal. And at the Stalag, I didn't eat a full meal. But there was soup, there were potatoes, occasionally bread. There was no medication at all. There was no shaving through. Once in a while, they would let us use a shower with a little bit of hot water. And soap, of course, was almost unheard of.
And you wore your own clothes?
Wore your own clothes, and my clothes were tattered. Absolutely tattered. The bomber jacket I was wearing had been penetrated by fire. Right. I was shot. I was shot in the leg and shot in the arm. My left sleeve of this bomber jacket was completely tattered. They didn't ever issue clothes. The socks I was wearing were rank, the shoes, everything. And you know, you try to wash them, you try to do this, but you're using cold water. You
can't drive. It's the winter time too.
You can't believe the cold and it's just almost impossible to describe the conditions there.
So when we see Hogan's Heroes, it's a paradise compared to what you had.
That storybook, that would have been great. Even the Germans, they were funny on Hogan's Heroes.
Right, sure.
But these guys were stern. They were
mean.
Mean, and you know, and prod you and hit you. Rank didn't mean a thing when you were. But one thing, they did not put me, any of the officers, there were only 4 of us on a work party. And of course we had meetings, we're trying to scheme out an escape and what to do.
Did you know what was happening in Europe?
Yes, we had a formation in April, and they did announce that President Roosevelt had died. They did tell us that.
Did you know anything about the situation with the Jews or concentration
We
camps?
had heard through the Germans, through some of the German guards, that there was concentration camps, that they were rounding up all the Jews in Europe, and it was just a horrible, horrible thing to hear and listen to. Because you, being a prisoner under a Nazi and German rule, and your life in danger, you know, any minute they could say, well, we don't like your looks, take you out, and that's it. They didn't have to answer to anyone. A guard didn't have to answer to anyone. If he decided he didn't like you, he took you out and he shot you. It was just another one.
Did anything like that happen in your group?
Yes, I did. There were work parties that went out.
Oh, the work parties.
Yeah, and most of the Jewish boys that went out, I never saw again.
Now, you showed us, and we have on the screen, a pass that you got from the...
Okay, now, wait a minute, we're jumping ahead.
Oh, we're jumping
okay, yeah, we're jumping a little ahead of this. But the Russians came in. We had heard that the Russians were coming.
How did you hear? The Germans told you.
Now, we knew they were frightened, and, you know, they were in communications either by telephone, either by courier, whatever, we don't know. But we knew that that particular night that the camp was going to be vacated by the German guards. And all of a sudden, we had gathered everybody. Nobody went to sleep that night. We had gathered up, and everybody was alerted. We were all awake. And we heard the Russians coming, and they came in by horse-drawn carts, very few vehicles. And the most of them were Mongolians. And the pots and pans were rattling on the back of the
cart.
Of the two-wheel carts.
Oh, my.
Just like the old days. You couldn't believe it. It took you back in history.
Sounds very primitive.
It was primitive. It was many years ago that you see this. And the first thing the Russians did was rip out all the barbed wire, the complete barbed wire encampment around the whole camp. And then, of course, the 4 officers were taken to meet the Russian major. And
could you converse at anyone?
The Russian major was a graduate of the University of Minnesota and could speak English.
Oh, my. Very
amazing. And he took a liking to me. We became buddies. Wherever he went, I went. When I went, he went.
Now, this is April 1945?
No, it's May.
May already.
May of 45. April is when they announced that President had died. And the Russians came in with medical personnel also. And they assigned a female doctor to me, to handle me. And then, of course, they had sick call. They had perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 doctors with them. They were all female, incidentally. And I don't want to get ahead of my story, but back in Russia those days, they took a girl that was born and registered, and they went into the house. They said, this girl is going to be a doctor. This girl will be a dentist. This girl will be a college professor. And they were taken by the government, raised by the Russian government.
Oh, taken out of their homes.
Taken out of their homes. Not captured or not against their will. But that's the way the Russians built up their
cadre of professionals.
Yes, right. And this girl was very young. I assume she was around 23, 24. And
was she a good doctor?
She was newer stuff. Again, couldn't speak good English, but she knew, you know, she examined me, she saw the condition I was in, and...
had your leg festered or your arm?
Oh, yes, there was a lot of infection there, which she cleaned up, she treated. Then they went out and they sent people out, they slaughtered cattle, they brought in chickens, they brought in eggs, and started cooking and having feasts and everything.
Well, how many prisoners were you that you had?
There were 4 officers and possibly 250 to 300 enlisted men.
So then you got very good treatment.
We got excellent treatment by the Russians. I couldn't believe it. Now, he also explained to us that we were going to be kept by the Russians approximately 1 to 2 months to build us up, because we were the first Americans that were ever liberated in the Russian zone by the Russians. And they were awaiting Russian prisoners liberated by the Americans to have an exchange. In the meantime, I had gained some strength. The Russian major and myself and a party went scouring the country, possibly for drugs. We broke into pharmacies and just took what we wanted, and we needed medical supplies badly and so forth. We ran into some of these satellite concentration camps.
Oh, so you went into concentration
camps? We went in. Now, these are not prisoner wars of the Jews were kept. And the first Jews I ever saw were in a barn, away, just inside the camp, in a barn, away from the big dormitories and from the big compounds. I think we were possibly anywhere around 25. The most horrible sight I ever saw in my life, with heads that had swelled up the size of perhaps a soccer ball, a volleyball, and the limbs. You can't describe it. You're just bones covered with skin. No flesh whatsoever. No flesh in the cheek. Nothing on the hands. No flesh at all. Just skin and bones. And you could just see the groin just sticking out the bones. They looked like a skeleton.
Why do you think they were separated from the others?
Well, they just probably didn't have enough room to keep everybody there. They put them wherever they could find room. And we tried to feed these people. We tried to give them medication, water, hot drinks, whatever. Nothing. They all died. They all passed away. They just could not consume food. They were too far gone. In other words, they were living death. If they didn't want to shoot them because it would waste a bullet.
Now, how did you know they were Jews?
There were stars on them. There were yellow stars on them. They were in the pajama-type stripes. And, of course, they started talking in Jewish, which I could understand. And then, of course, the Russian major, of course, knew I was Jewish. And then, of course, everybody knew I was Jewish after that.
But it didn't make any difference.
It didn't make a bit of difference, no. And I never denied the fact after that, because we were liberated.
Do you know which concentration camps you went into?
You know, it was so confusing there.
Because we do know the Russians liberated Auschwitz.
Yes, I was with, I think it was Auschwitz. And there was another one not too far from there.
Bergen-Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen. I was just going to say Belsen. And we had seen all this. Now, I saw the trenches there. They hadn't been covered yet, with thousands, or literally thousands of bodies, just helter-skelter, just thrown in there. And they were all skeletal-type people in there. And they were freed. There were no Germans around there either. But these people couldn't maneuver.
They were just too
They were just too far gone. You couldn't believe what you saw. You thought it was something that you couldn't. I can't describe it. And emotionally, I was just gone with seeing something like that. And knowing these were all Jewish people. I couldn't believe what I saw. And that was it. And then just to then realize how you were a prisoner there for 5-6 months with this type of person, and to come through it. You know, I'm really surprised they didn't just wipe out the prisoner war camp. They didn't have enough food themselves. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough fuel for their aircraft, for their tanks, for their vehicles. They didn't have enough food for their soldiers. They didn't have medical supplies. Everything the Germans had was ersatz. There were no such thing as gauze bandages.
Well,
everything was paper.
This was the end of the war.
The end of the war. Everything was gone.
When were you liberated?
Well, I wasn't.
When did you actually leave the Russian?
In July.
In July.
And we had a tremendous ceremony with bands and music and speeches, and it was like a light opera. There was Russian songs, there were Russian dancers, there were American generals, and then right after the ceremony, when they turned the American prisoners over to the Americans and the Russians turned the Russians over to them, I was flown right to Paris to be interrogated by our own people to see, because we were the first prisoners to be liberated by the Russians. We were the first camp, the first stalag to be liberated by Russians. And they wanted to know what treatment we got, what the Russians did, how they acted, and everything. Of course, we were allies at the time.
Yes.
There were only good words for them.
Right. And were you in good physical and mental shape?
No, I was mentally, I was a little strong because I had fought every minute of I wouldn't let myself lay down and say, I'm ill, I'm going to act ill and be ill. I just fought mentally to keep my strength and to keep going. And I did build up a little bit. There's no question about it. And after I was interrogated by the generals in Paris, I was sent to a camp to be built up. And that's where, with the eggnogs and the cocoa. And
that was in France?
In France. And all the medical things that you could think of. There were psychiatrists there, there were psychologists there, there were legal people there. There was a PX, of course they stripped me immediately. Go into the PX, pick out whatever you want as far as clothes is concerned.
It must have felt like Cinderella.
Well, not really, you know, it was just, there was no happiness there. It was a feeling of elation that I'm free, but how am I? How am I going to act? What's going to happen to me? I don't know. Because myself being a POW didn't affect me as much as going into these concentration camps. That's what really set me off.
You were
that
in shock.
I couldn't take. I couldn't believe this was happening. And like I told you before, that I wouldn't have come for this interview had you just not mentioned the Holocaust. And you told me that this will be shown to some person somewhere in the future. If one person ever remembers this and sees it, and get some good out of it, then I'm very, very happy about it. Because this is bringing back things that I didn't want to bring back.
That you really
that I had put in the back of my mind that I hadn't thought about. Now, after I came out of service, I was released from service in 1946. I was home exactly 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The first thing I did, I joined the downtown YMCA, and then I went into business. I opened a used car lot right downtown behind the YMCA. That was my first used car lot.
You just wanted to get on with normalcy.
I had to get on. I was single. I was not married at the time. And I just wanted to get in to try to forget and put everything in the past. And
but in your modesty, you forgot your medals, and we have an assortment of the medals that you acquired, so maybe you will tell us about them.
I think that one there is the latest one I got, and that came 44 years after. That came this year.
Just recently?
Yeah, it came, and it was presented to me by Senator Masiello.
And what is it for?
And that is a POW medal, prisoner of war, and it's the first medal that's ever been issued.
For prisoners
of war.
Of all wars.
Of all wars. Now, World War I, for Vietnam, for Korea, and World War II. It's the same medal if you were a prisoner of war. You had to be a prisoner of war a certain length of time.
So there were many medals like that given out.
Yeah. And
now we have an assortment of other medals.
Okay. Now, the one on top, you see there, are the wings that I wore. L is for liaison pilot. We were different from other pilots. Liaison pilots, because we were assigned to field artillery. And the other medals, there are 2 air medals, there's a Bronze Star, there's 2 Purple Hearts, and there are a lot of recognition medals, which I did not bring for being in a certain theater at a certain time for meritorious service.
Oh, ribbons.
Ribbons and so forth. There were actual medals, but I just didn't bring them.
Now you are wearing a caterpillar pin on your lapel.
Okay.
Do you want to
the
tell us about that?
Pin. Now, evidently, the Army records were sent through the government to this corporation that manufactured the parachutes that we used to save our lives. And the way you get into the Caterpillar Club is when your life is spared by the use of a parachute.
Oh.
And when we bailed out of our airplane, we both had parachutes on that were manufactured by the Switlik company.
Switlik.
Switlik. And S-W-I-T-L-I-K. And it's a very, very closed, small
Sounds
club.
exclusive.
Exclusive club. And right now, I don't think there are too many left wearing this pin. And
Did you get this recently?
No, I got this back in 45 or 46. I can't remember when, but I believe it was 45. Yeah, that they sent it with a big letter of commendation and thanking us for using a parachute. And it was a very gushy letter, you know. Just
Why a Caterpillar?
because of the silk parachute.
Oh, silk
See,
parachute.
yeah,
I see,
now the
Caterpillar.
parachutes are made out of nylon. See,
I
and it's
see.
a different type. The kind we had was the great big circle one with perhaps 25 or 30 shrouds coming down that's strapped around your leg, around your shoulder, under your armpits and so forth, with the release ring. It was a ring right at your chest. You pounded it, the ring came out, and you pulled the ripcord. And when you were free, if there was enough air current as you're falling, it would open the flaps and the parachute would pop. Hopefully.
If you were
Hopefully.
lucky.
Yeah.
And you were lucky.
But there were very few casualties where I would say where a parachute did not open.
Are you, incidentally, are you in touch, or were you in touch with your co-pilot or whatever you called him,
No.
the one that you pushed out of the
now
plane?
here's what happened. When he bailed out of the airplane, he landed on the American side, and I showed you a letter I got from one of my buddies in the Lieutenant Clark. His name was Brian, the fellow that I was with, crawled back on his hands and knees. He was not wounded by gunfire, but he had hurt his back. And later on I found out that he had broken his back.
Oh, dear me.
When he landed, and he's in a hospital somewhere in Texarkana, Texas, as far as I know today.
Oh, still?
He's still alive, but he's incapacitated with a broken back.
Unfortunate.
And I never been in touch with him. I didn't know where he was until I got this letter that he was alive.
And they didn't know where you were?
They didn't know where I was at all for 5, 6, 7 months. And that's how I got to know about Brian. But in the letter, you'll see how he was worried about me because he knew the reason I was a POW is because of him. Because if we had both bailed at the same time, we would have both landed on this side of the...
On our side.
On our side, not the enemy side.
Sidney, we have to conclude very shortly. Do you have a message or anything you want to say in conclusion?
Just remember, being a Jew is one of the best things that could ever... If you were born and raised as a Jew, stay a Jew. Never deny it. Be proud. And remember, there are people in this world today that I know do not believe there was ever a Holocaust. They do not. They think it's a fiction by the Jews. Believe me, it is true. Believe every word of it. It's something you cannot describe. Just stay a Jew and be proud.
And know your history.
Yeah, exactly.
And don't let it happen again.
Don't ever let it happen again. Your heart and soul, your financial gains, whatever, stay with it.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.